Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A warm welcome to all of you to the Academy of Konrad Adenauer Foundation, to our cooperation meeting with the International Literature Festival Berlin and the Hoffmann and Kampe Publishing House. As to the topic that was announced, liberalism and its discontents. How can freedom stand up against the challenges of the present? This topic is definitely a very current and hot one. It's not just topical, it's also important. And nevertheless, it would tonight not have filled this hall as much as this is the case, hadn't we had the chance to welcome a guest whose new book deals with exactly this topic and has since yesterday been available in German. And we are highly pleased to have him on board. A warm welcome to Professor Fukuyama. Francis Fukuyama is certainly one of the most well-known political theorists of the present. And since at least 30 years, he's one of the most quoted intellectuals. And it has double importance that he has looked into exactly this topic quite accurately 3 decades after his first world bestseller, with the modest title, The End of History. And since that time, nearly everyone knows him. Everyone who looks into politics, history, and political systems, and actual and purported system changes. He himself wrote in his book, or to be more specific, in his foreword on the book presented today, that liberalism and liberal democracy have for several years been retracting, and I quote from his foreword, the NGO Freedom House said that political rights and civic freedoms in the 3 decades between 1974 and the early 2000s gained importance worldwide. In the following some 15 years up until 2021, their importance, however, steadily decreased again, a process that can be called social regression or recession. Democratic recession or depression, sorry. So this cannot be overlooked and it can't be disputed either. And by all means, this is not what many of us, after this miraculous system transformation, grand transformation in Central and Eastern Europe at the end of the 80s and early 90s, would have imagined. The hopes that were widespread at that time and the expectations have never been described in a more concise, more aggressive way, and in a way that was more powerful than by you, dear Mr. Fukuyama. And many presumptions were expressed on that basis. We will now subject these to a reality test together. At the time, your book met with worldwide attention. You talk about the downfall of communism and the authoritarian systems as the end of a major ideological struggle and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government, unquote. So, if there was something like a final form of human government, we will probably have to wait for it quite a while. The competition between the systems has obviously not yet been decided, and also a triumph of liberalism or democracy is definitely not something we're seeing. This makes dealing with this topic particularly important and particularly urgent too. And we're highly pleased that tonight, in a dialogue with Tobias Endler, you will deal with your own perceptions of this topic. I'm very pleased that with Mr. Endler we have a person who is very well versed in German and in American affairs and also worked at many American and German institutions. He's the dialogue partner. I'm very much looking forward to this evening. At the beginning, Mr. Jung, as managing director of Hoffmann and Campe, will say something about this publication and perhaps also other related publications. I would like to thank you very much and also Literaturhaus for this wonderful cooperation that has made it this evening possible. After this event, I'm looking forward to the reception in the Academy here, which also will provide us with an opportunity to exchange a few impressions, not just from this event, but also talking about one's own hopes, perceptions, perhaps also disappointments of the past 3 decades. We are looking back to since the most astonishing change in the more recent past. So, another very warm welcome to all of you. And now, Mr. Jung, I would like to ask you for your welcome note. Mr. Lammert, Mr. Endler, dear guests, dear Frank. My name is Tim Jung, and as announced, I would like to welcome you as the Publishing Managing Director of Hoffmann and Campe. Also, I would like to express my warmest thanks to you, dear Mr. Lammert, that tonight we have the chance to be your guests here with our author, Francis Fukuyama, for the best reason one can think of, namely a premiere of a book, the premiere of Francis Fukuyama's new book, Liberalism and Its Discontents, which is now published in Hoffmann and Campe. I would like to use this opportunity, shamelessly so to say, to also add that not just this book was just published at Hoffmann and Campe, but also an extended new edition of the said book, The End of History, after it had been sold out for a long time, which is probably one of the most quoted works of political science of the modern time. It's really worthwhile reading. Still, today, as when one wants to know what people are talking about or criticizing about it. Dear Frank, it's an honor and
I bow my head to you, and I want to say thank you. Thank you so much for coming over and for not only meeting your German audience here and tomorrow in Cologne, but also a legion of journalists, all of them very eager, and some of them even joining you on short cab rides to have a chance to talk to you for a very few minutes. But most of all, I want to say thank you, Frank, for providing us with your thoughts on the, in fact, alarming state of liberalism. Liberalism, which in fact is the most necessary requirement to be able to do what we are all doing tonight, for coming together as free individuals, having the chance to speak open and freely. Ja, Francis Fukuyama weiter vorzustellen.
Well, I think we don't need to introduce Francis Fukuyama any further. Mr. Lammert said it. He is one of the most brilliant minds of our time, who, with his world bestseller, The End of History, caused a journalistic earthquake that is still to be sensed today and can now also be read. During his long career, he published a long list of books. Identity is the last book that was published in Hoffmann and Kamp, a title that clearly points out that Francis Fukuyama is someone who has a distinct feel for the big political topics of our time and can judge them and put them into context like no one else. Karl-Heinz Dürr was the translator of his book. He translated it in a very elegant and lucid way. The book is about liberalism being under major pressure, being fought from the right wings as well as from the left wings. It's very important in this context. And Mr. Endler, I don't want to anticipate what you want to say, but pardon me for this one sentence, to know exactly what Francis Fukuyama speaks about when he talks about liberalism. He doesn't talk about the program of an individual political party, but he talks about the limiting of a state reign by law and constitutions that protect people, individuals living in this jurisdiction. So all of us. And against this background, I wish wish all of us that this day, this evening, and the days after can be perceived by us not just interested audience, but as proponents and also as supporters of a liberal democracy, of an educated society that seems so obvious and natural to us, but as we will hear tonight, is not natural and obvious. And in this sense, I wish all of us an elucidating as well as a committal evening. Thank you very much for your attention.
Microphones on? Yeah. Thanks so much, everybody, and a very warm welcome to all of you who join us in this beautiful auditorium tonight, which has a bit of a Stanford University auditorium feel, is what we said. Welcome to all those who join us online, just as well, for what is a very special occasion. The German premiere of liberalism and its discontents, Der Liberalismus und seine Feinde, as we just heard, coming out in a beautiful German translation. I'm delighted and honored to welcome on stage the author of the book, Francis Fukuyama. Frank, it's great to see you again and to have another opportunity to talk to you. Before we get going and before I'll introduce tonight's protagonist, let me thank those again who have made this evening possible, Professor Norbert Lammert and the entire Konrad Adenauer Foundation, and especially Daniel Feldhaus, who has put so much effort and dedication into this event. So thank you, Daniel. I would also like to thank the International Literature Festival Berlin, Tim Jung of Hoffmann und Kampe, whom we just heard speak, and Julia von Hardenberg of Mondello for putting all the strings together. All of us, and I'm sure all of you, are looking forward to some 75 minutes of exciting thoughts and what we can learn from this book as we take in a very turbulent world before our eyes, a world that I think is more in need of interpretation than ever before, which is why this book is so much on time. Afterwards, there will be an opportunity for you to buy the book and even have it signed, so I hope that pen of yours is ready, Frank, for a long stretch of signing books. My next short task is both easy and difficult since it involves introducing tonight's protagonist, and this is easy enough, and we've heard this before, since he's the kind of protagonist who doesn't really need that much of an introduction anymore, but it's also a tricky task, because in a CV that would fill a book by itself, you don't want to miss out on the most important parts and then get off on the wrong foot right away. So let me try my best. Francis Fukuyama is the Olivier Nomellini Senior Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University. He's also director of the Ford Dorsey Masters in International Policy and a professor by courtesy of political science. Frank holds a PhD in political science from Harvard University. He has worked for the RAND Corporation and was on the policy planning staff of the US Department of State. He has taught at George Mason University and Johns Hopkins University, and he served as a member of the President's Council on Bioethics in the early 2000s. He's also, among other affiliations, a non-resident fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Frank Fukuyama became famous early on for his 1989 essay, The End of History, that was mentioned before, The End of History, ? Which he then turned into a book in 1992, and the book went on to appear in over 20 foreign editions. Ever since the late 1980s, really, Frank Fukuyama has been known for one thing in particular, and that's the courage to paint the broader picture and to make us take one step back from the turmoil of events and the avalanche of information and the daily challenges that we face, and yes, the daily catastrophes, such as the war in Ukraine, such as soaring energy prices and populist threats to democracy. And also the temptation, I feel, that all of us feel time and again to withdraw into our small private lives and let the outside world pass us by, something that Frank has warned against time and again in his work and through his work. And all of this, Frank, brings us right to your newest book, Liberalism and Its Discontents. Let's take the path that you take in the book. In the very beginning, you consider it very important to clarify what you talk about when you talk about liberalism, as was mentioned before, and what you don't talk about. So to help us into the conversation, maybe you could define again what you mean when you talk about liberalism, and also why you choose that specific approach.
Sure. So again, thanks to everyone for hosting me tonight. It's a great pleasure to be in Berlin. This is honestly one of my favorite cities, and I'm really very happy to be able to introduce this book here. So especially for a German audience, it's important to note that the way I use the term liberalism is not the way that it's typically used here. It doesn't refer to a center-right, position that's more in favor of free markets and less government intervention. I have a broader definition of liberalism that really stems from its origins in the middle of the 17th century at the end of Europe's wars of religion, when there was an effort to lower the horizons of politics so that politics wouldn't be about one particular religious doctrine being imposed on a population, but would rather allow different people of diverse religious confessions to live together under a system of toleration. So a liberal, in my view, believes in the universal equality of human dignity, that all human beings have a certain basic dignity that needs to be protected by a state that grants them rights and actually enforces those rights through a rule of law. The rule of law is really a limitation of state power that says the state can't do whatever it wants with its subjects, but it has to operate according to law under constitutional checks and balances that limit that power. And that means that a big welfare state like Sweden or Denmark is a liberal state. Germany is a liberal state, but so is the United States or Japan, countries that have a lower degree of social protection. What's important, though, is that rule of law that protects individuals.
So the way you describe liberalism in very basic terms, in fundamental terms, what shape does liberalism, classical liberalism, take from your point of view? Is it more of a fixed set of principled ideas, almost like guiding stars that we need to sort of interpret in the right way to move forward, also in the 21st century? Or is liberalism more a collection of fluid ideas that will be affected by the outside world, and what's going on in the world?
Well, liberalism is a framework for, in a way, managing diversity and managing conflict. In a liberal society, we don't anoint one religion or one, way of life as the dominant one that everybody has to follow, and that means that in liberal societies, they do tend to be fluid and ideas evolve. Freedom of speech is obviously a cardinal virtue in a liberal regime, and that means that, ideas will evolve and culture will evolve. But the liberal framework is something fixed, and the idea that individuals as human beings have dignity is something that's fixed. And I think the moment that you begin to challenge that belief, then you cease, being liberal and you move into something that's a different framework. So, for example, Prime Minister Modi in India is taking a country that was given a liberal constitution and a liberal framework in 1946 when the Republic of India was founded by Gandhi and Nehru, and he's moving it towards a narrower understanding that's based on Hinduism, which is unfortunate because, not everybody in India is a Hindu. There's 200 million Muslims in that country, and that is not, that's a direct assault on a basic liberal principle. So that's not something I think that's really can be accommodated within a liberal framework.
Right, so it is a framework of fixed principles, as you just said, and yet, as you point out in your book, which so eloquently, by the way, it's a very non-academic book, I think, in the best sense, in that it's very readable, it's accessible, and it doesn't have a lot of footnotes. So you say it's a framework of principles, and yet you make the point in your book that it also needs justification, right? And has always needed justification. And you mentioned 3 justifications for liberalism and for liberal societies. Maybe you could take us through these justifications just quickly. The first one being a very pragmatic one, and you call it a pragmatic one. Yeah.
So it's important, and I think especially for younger people that have grown up in a liberal society and they don't always recognize, what the advantages of their particular way of life are. So there are 3 that I say are central. The first one is a pragmatic justification. Liberalism is a way of governing over diverse societies, and the diversity can take a lot of forms. It really goes back to the origins of liberalism in the middle of the 17th century. After the Protestant Reformation, Europe fell into 150 years of almost continuous warfare. I don't need to remind anyone in Germany, the consequences of the 30 Years' War. And at the end of that period, a lot of early liberals began to argue maybe we shouldn't be fighting over what confession, our prince follows. Maybe we should have a different kind of system that says what we want is to preserve life itself rather than a particular vision of the good life. And in the 19th and 20th century, it wasn't religion that was the major driver of conflict in Europe. It was a expansive and aggressive form of nationalism. And again, that led to 2 world wars and, really the destruction of, much of Europe. And once again, I think there was a return to liberal principles. That's really the principles on which the European Union was founded, that said, we shouldn't fight over what nation, what people will be dominant over other people, but rather, live in a liberal framework. So that's the pragmatic justification. And again, if you want to see the utility of this, think about India, where there's been lots of communal violence between Muslims and Hindus. It seems to me the only way that you can really manage that is by treating people as individuals, by not setting these communities against one another. And so that pragmatism is still important.
And there's a strong notion of tolerance that you also mentioned.
Tolerance
is necessary.
Tolerance is critical in a liberal society because people are not going to agree with you necessarily about the most important things as defined by religion or by a very strong cultural tradition, and therefore you have to learn to tolerate people that are different from yourself. The limits of tolerance are really only when it begins to undermine the principles of liberalism itself, so it's not unlimited tolerance, but that is the hallmark of a liberal society.
Yeah. The second justification for liberalism, we'll come back to the pragmatic one, and as we move on, and you also dedicate chapters to the critics of liberalism, obviously, and to the shortcomings of it. Let's, for now, stick with the three justifications for liberalism. The second one being a moral one, about morality. How does morality fit in here?
Well, liberalism is basically an assertion of as I said, the equal dignity of all human beings. And I think the moral dimension of liberalism is the way that it safeguards the human ability to choose. This is something that's deeply embedded in the Judeo-Christian tradition. So in the book of Genesis, God tells Adam and Eve not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They eat, and then they can see that they're naked, and they're cast out of the garden for basically acquiring moral judgment. They make the wrong judgment, but all of a sudden they've got a higher status than animals or plants or the rest of nature because they can see the difference between right and wrong. And I think that story encapsulates, an important understanding of the moral nature of human beings, that every single human being may differ in terms of looks, race, skin color, gender, lots of other characteristics, but every human being is capable of moral choice, and it's that makes human beings worthy of respect. And in a liberal regime, the regime protects that autonomy. You can choose what you do in life, who you marry, what you believe in, the kind of confession that you profess. You can speak freely. And that denotes a respect, for basic human rights. And again, that's a very moral understanding of, what liberalism is about.
Yeah. And thank you for this. And again, we'll come back to this because I think we can all imagine some situations, like practical situations on the ground in today's societies, in your hometown of Chicago, in parts of Berlin, in parts of Frankfurt, the city I spent a lot of time in, where maybe the tolerance and freedom principle is a little stretched, and there's frictions as well. But we'll get back to this. The third principle that I think is crucial and that you mentioned is the economic principle, and obviously John Locke, the father of liberalism, comes to mind. So what's it to do with the economic principle that you?
Well, so among the basic rights that a liberal society protects is the right to own private property and the right to transact and to engage in commercial transactions. And it's been associated with the rise of modern economic life. And in fact, I don't think that you could have a modern, wealthy society, if it's not connected to a basic market economy protected by a rule of law in which those economic rights are protected. So the first rich countries in the world were, England and the Netherlands, that were the most liberal societies, in their day. But even today, if you look at the rise of China, China is in no way a politically liberal country, but in 1978, Deng Xiaoping came to power. He reformed the economic side of Chinese life by essentially allowing people to own private property, in effect own private property. Within 4 years, the output of Chinese agriculture doubled because Chinese peasants could all of a sudden keep the surplus that they had earned. And you wouldn't have the economic miracle, this modern China, if, at least in the economic sphere, China did not open up markets, did not open itself to global trade. To this day, they are completely dependent on their ability to operate within a liberal global economic order. And so, again, it's a demonstration of one of the big advantages of living in a liberal society.
Yeah. Now, just playing devil's advocate here for a moment, I think the book is full of valuable insights and also some surprises. What made me stumble, and I guess a lot of people were waiting for the other big term out there, for democracy, and for you to actually, bring up democracy. And so my question, sort of somewhat provocatively, would be: Can we do without democracy as we talk about liberalism? Because in the book, at some point, you seem to suggest that the two need not necessarily be so intertwined or so closely connected, and you say, I'm quoting you now, liberalism and democracy are based on distinct principles. So maybe you could elaborate on,
Sure.
on their relationship a little.
So liberalism and democracy are, generally speaking, allies, and they support one another, but they are different. So liberalism is really that protection from the state. I mean, it's the limitation of state power through law. Democracy really has to do with the accountability of leaders to the people, or as large a group of the people as possible. But it's possible to have one without the other. So Viktor Orban, ever since 2014, has been explaining that he's building not a liberal democracy, but an illiberal democracy. And he's right about that. So he is legitimately elected. Fidesz, his party, just won a pretty big victory in the latest Hungarian election. But he has put the courts under, his party's control. He controls the media. You don't really have the kinds of civic freedoms and political freedoms that you would have in a liberal democracy in that country. And conversely, you can have a liberal autocracy. So a lot of the states in the Persian Gulf are like that. They allow, free commerce. Quite frankly, Germany in the 19th century was, one of the prime examples of a liberal autocracy where you didn't have, or you had very limited democratic elections, but you had strong protection of property rights, and therefore Germany in the late 19th century became a big economic powerhouse. So they're separate, but quite frankly, I don't think that either democracy or liberalism works very well if the other one isn't present. If you only have liberalism, I think you tend to have increasing inequality because a market economy produces inequality. It produces, vulnerabilities for people that are dependent on distant markets, but something happens in the global economy and they lose their incomes. And at that point, you really, liberalism isn't sufficient, to protect them. And so you need a state that can do some degree of redistribution, that can provide, health care and education and other kinds of benefits. And for that reason, I think that the most successful liberal societies have actually been ones in which there is this close alliance with democracy, where the democracy part makes governments accountable and also, provides a certain degree of de facto equality, which a purely liberal society may not. The reason I wrote a book about liberalism and not about liberal democracy and not about democracy is that right now I think it's actually liberalism. We talk about a liberal democracy where you have those two components allied to one another, but right now the big threat is to the liberal part of liberal democracy. Erdogan, Orban, Donald Trump, Narendra Modi, all these politicians are legitimately elected in democratic elections. A little bit of tinkering in Hungary and places like that, but by and large, they are democratically elected, and what they do with their democratic mandates is to clamp down on the liberal part. They go after the courts, they go after the independent media, they try to deinstitutionalize, their societies in the interest of being, strong rulers. And that's why I think liberalism is really the first object of attack in the current age.
Clamp down on the liberal part is the sort of the key word. We'll get back to the democracy issue for sure, because I think it's also in a lot of people's minds, the systemic competition that we see these days between democracies and autocratic systems, and and we'll get back to this. For now, we've heard a lot of good arguments, I think, in favor of liberalism and liberal societies. We've heard a few good justifications, but I think it's fair to say that liberalism is not in a very comfortable position these days. There's attacks from all sides, and you dedicate entire chapters to these attackers that if I read you correctly, they take two different forms. So there are those who take issue with some of the premises of liberalism or liberal society, so they don't buy it anymore. It doesn't work for them. And there are those, and I'd like to focus on those for a moment now, who have driven liberalism to extremes in a way and twisted it and turned it into something else, really. So let's take these on one at a time, and maybe you could talk us through these dangers and threats to liberalism. And let's start on the right, maybe, and the key word here is neoliberalism, certainly. What's happening here, and why is that a problem for the original idea of liberalism?
Yeah, well, the general argument that I make throughout the book is that liberalism is based on certain ideas that in themselves I think are very solid and good, but in application they've been taken to extremes that then make them unsupportable. So neoliberalism is a good example of that. For some people, neoliberalism is a synonym for capitalism. That's not my understanding. I think that you cannot have a modern economy without, markets and private property and the like. What neoliberalism was a movement that really took shape under people like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. It was endorsed by very respectable economists like Milton Friedman.
Chicago School.
The whole Chicago School that argued that markets were really the solution to virtually every social dilemma, and they could be relied on to make the entire society rich, and that the state really didn't have much of a role. And I think that this led then to a lot of privatizations and a lot of deregulation. Some of that was actually quite justified because I think a lot of developed countries had been overregulated by the time you get to the 1970s, but it also led to some disastrous outcomes, and particularly in the deregulation of the financial markets that began in the late 80s and continued through the 1990s. You all of a sudden had this world in which capital could flow, easily, abetted by, the electronic nature of transactions from one part of the world to another. And this destabilized the global financial system. It led to, repeated financial crises beginning in the early 1990s. It culminated really in the subprime crisis in the US in 2008, the Euro crisis here in Europe. And, actually, prior to the 1990s, the world had been financially stable. We didn't have these crises, but it was really this deregulation driven by a kind of neoliberal faith that markets would regulate themselves that produced that outcome, which then, makes people lose their jobs, makes people lose their houses because their mortgages don't work anymore. And that, in turn, produces the populist reaction on both the right and the left. In the United States, both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, in a sense, are responding to, the kinds of inequalities that was created by this neoliberal set of policies that, appeared after the 1980s.
The way you describe neoliberalism, and you make it clear, the economic dimension of it, I think you made clear, and it has been catastrophic in certain sectors. Do you look at the self-centered way of life and people sort of concentrating on their own lives and not really care much about society around them anymore? Is that, do you also mean it in a broader sense, I guess is what I'm saying, or do you focus on the economic and dimension of neoliberalism?
Well, the economic dimension obviously impacted the social dimension. Milton Friedman wrote this famous article back in the 1970s saying that the only social responsibility of a business is to its shareholders, to maximize their profits. And ever since then, many graduates of business schools came away thinking, well, my major goal in life is to get rich. It doesn't kind of matter how I get rich. If I have to bend the rules to get rich, that's okay, because Milton Friedman told me that that's actually good for society. He didn't actually say that, but that was the interpretation that came out. And so I do think that there was a certain moral justification of selfishness that that then had other knock-on social consequences in terms of people not taking seriously these responsibilities to the broader society.
I think one could make the argument that across the younger generation especially, and there's some members of the younger generation among us today as well, that maybe there's a slight shift that can be observed these days, and people talk a lot about work-life balance and maybe not give their entire life to becoming rich, but
well, no, I actually think we've moved beyond this neoliberal period. governments are now stepping in a big way. You know, they did this in COVID. They're doing this now in response to the energy crisis. So the idea that governments should stay out of people's lives is, you know, that's like 10 years out of date or 50. In fact, Liz Truss in Britain right now seems to have not realized that she's living in a different age. She thinks she's the latest incarnation of Margaret Thatcher, and as a result has really screwed up the whole British, you know, economy. But that's a different story.
And we'll see how long she's going to be around with the British election system. Let's move on over to the other side of the political spectrum for now, and what you refer to as the progressive left. And the keyword here is identity politics, and how do they relate to the idea of classical liberalism, or what's the problem, what's the challenge you see here?
Well, so you have to understand that there's actually two types of identity politics, one of which is completely compatible with liberalism and the other of which is not. So the type that is compatible is, you know, for example, embodied in the American civil rights movement, where African Americans said, we are discriminated against because of our race. We're going to band together and demand to be treated the same as white people. Right, this famous speech of Martin Luther King where he says, I look forward to a day when my children will be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And so he was asking to be, you know, an equal of everybody else in the society. And so that's a liberal version of identity politics, where you use your identity to push in a democratic political system for inclusion. However, there's another version that says that your fixed identity, meaning your race, your ethnicity, your gender, the religion you were born into, your sexual orientation, are fundamental to who you are, more important than who you are as an individual, and that society should recognize your group identity over your individual identity. And that, you know, also rides on top of a tradition of critical theory or postmodernism that, you know, essentially denied the liberal premise of, you know, universal human equality, that this was simply, in a way, a doctrine that was promoted by, you know, certain elites at a certain point of time, but didn't actually represent the reality, which was one of social oppression. And that kind of view still dominates in many parts of the progressive left, and it challenges this fundamental, you know, liberal premise about the equal dignity of all human beings. And it actually, at one extreme, it kind of joins hands with nationalism, which also says that certain groups should have dominance over other groups, but, you know, they're looking at different different groups within the society.
Yeah, and I was just going to ask you exactly that question. You know, do you see alliances across the political spectrum from the left wing and the right wing against liberalism? I'm asking because in Germany we witness a very peculiar phenomenon that we call the Querfront phenomenon. Mm-hmm. So you actually have alliances between these two sort of ends of the political spectrum that you wouldn't otherwise. Very strange bedfellows actually, mm-hmm. closing ranks. Mm-hmm. Is this something that you feel is going on, you know, like in general in the United States as well?
Well, I think it's going on. It's not so much in the United States. It's certainly going on in geopolitics, where the old categories of left and right really do not define alliances anymore. So, you know, you have China and Russia being supportive of Iran. You know, China is ostensibly a left-wing communist regime that still, you know, helps Iran in many ways, you know, a theocracy, a kind of medieval theocracy. You have Russia, which is, you know, hard to put on an ideological spectrum because, you know, they look back at the Soviet Union with nostalgia. On the other hand, they seem to resemble nothing so much as a fascist regime. And so, you know, the thing that they hold in common is opposition to liberalism. That's what binds these groups together. And I suspect any alliance between the extreme left and the extreme right is a little bit like what happened in the 1930s when there was a similar, you know, communist fascist alliance. What they want to do is they want to kill the center, and once they kill the center, then, you know, their side can take over.
Yeah. And I can see that point, and it's really dangerous when it comes to killing the center, obviously. But I think the book of yours is so great because you also represent the criticisms that these people from the left and right bring in, and you don't sort of smooth over these criticisms. And I wonder whether some of this criticism is actually justified, and you do in the book as well. So, especially on the left of center side, I mean, basically what they seem to complain about is hypocrisy in the end, right? That liberal societies don't live up to their own ideals in a way, and they don't treat everybody the same. So what would you say to that sort of, somebody comes to you and makes that?
Yeah, I would say that's true. The United States, if you look at the United States, the Declaration of Independence in 1776 asserts that all men are created equal, but as everybody knows, when the country was founded, only white men with property had the right to vote and fully participate as full human beings with rights. And it was only after 2 centuries of struggle that African Americans, women, other Native Americans, other people that had been excluded from that original circle of humanity achieved those equal rights. And so it was a very long and painful process. It's one that has not been completed because people, in fact, are not treated equally. If you have the wrong skin color, if you don't have money, you're not going to get the same kind of treatment by the justice system as other people will. So it is a question of failed promise. But I think that what is important is to see whether there actually has been progress in terms of fulfilling that promise. And there, I don't think there's any question. And that's one of the problems with some of the progressive arguments that are being made by critical theory today, where some people will assert that, police violence in American cities, which is, it's bad, it exists, and, it's a moral wrong, but that it's basically the equivalent of lynching or, even going back beyond that, it's really the same impulse that was behind slavery, and that things really haven't changed since the days of slavery, which I just think is a manifestly absurd proposition. When I was young, I grew up in New York City, actually, in the 1960s, but in the 1960s, in early 1960s, in Washington, D.C., if you were an African American, you could not walk in certain parts of downtown Washington because it was a segregated city. Right. And, to say that nothing's changed since then, I think is just ridiculous. But you can say that at the same time that you admit that we are still failing in many ways, to really provide the kind of equality that a liberal regime promises. So, I think that's my view of why liberalism is hypocritical, but it's also reformable, and that's why, as a system, it still deserves support.
It's reformable. It's a point you make in the book as well. As you quote John Gray, there is always it can be corrected, it can be improved, which is certainly a fixture that a character that sort of sets it apart from other systems. We've heard a lot about those discontent, those that are not satisfied with liberalism by now, and there's, I think, good reason why you called the book "Liberalism and Its Discontents." And I was struck by the German title of the book as well, which is Der Liberalismus und seine Feinde. So I would be curious, as in liberalism and its enemies. Mm-hmm. So I would be curious how you look at this. Do you see a continuum? Do you see this being one line, basically, and there's people who are discontent, there's people who are just not satisfied, and then there's downright enemies to liberalism as well. And if that's the case, why do you think that happens? Do people move on from being not satisfied to being downright enemies? Is there any way for them to move back on that spectrum? How do you look at these terms?
I think that some of the problems with liberalism and the critique of it and the criticisms are due to these deformations, in my view, of basic liberal doctrine. So neoliberalism, on the right, and identity politics on the left, I think, are not necessary interpretations. They're wrong interpretations of the basic liberal doctrine, but they do originate in liberal societies. They're not coming from Mars, they're not coming from China. These are ideas that people in liberal societies have generated that then produce a counter-reaction. So obviously, the neoliberalism produced a lot of unhappiness on the part of progressive people, while the kind of extreme identity politics has then caused people on the right to make assertions of identity themselves. That the former majority population of the country says, no, we're actually the discriminated minority, and our rights are not being respected. And so that's the sense in which, at least with the rise of populism, and both on the left and the right, the problems are actually being generated within liberal societies themselves. You don't need a Russia or China to do that. Nonetheless, there is Russia and China, and there's now a kind of joining of the geopolitical with the internal and domestic, and the two then feed off of each other. So, Vladimir Putin really did try to help Donald Trump get elected, and Donald Trump liked that help, and he likes Putin, and did a lot to bolster Putin's position, and would if he were elected president again.
So those who have a problem with liberalism, the illiberals of this world, seem to be closing ranks. But a book like yours, and again, just to tease you a little, which talks about discontents, aren't you preaching to the choir in a way? In that everybody who's open to read this book, everybody who joins us tonight and online, these are going to be people who are open to debate, who like the idea of a liberal society, even if they don't agree on everything. And they, in fact, regard this as a central feature of liberal society. We don't have to agree. So I guess my question is, do you consider it a good idea even to reach out to all those who just don't want to live in a liberal society anymore? And do you feel it's more important to maybe strengthen our side, and make put democracy in a position where it can defend itself? Or would you always try and reach out to everybody eventually and win them over to liberal societies?
Well, you can't reach out to everybody. There's a lot of hardcore racists and xenophobes that you're really not going to touch. And so, to be persuasive, you do need to have people that have an openness to other types of ideas. And I think there are some, and I think the battle of ideas is quite important. Right now, at least in the United States, we have a group of right-wing intellectuals. So Donald Trump doesn't have ideas. I mean, he's got just instincts, but he's never formulated any of this into a coherent, theory or ideology. And so there are a lot of people on the right that are trying to do that. And people like Yoram Hazony or Patrick Deneen, you get a lot of conservative Catholic integralists that, are making basically an argument for reinserting religion or a very deep set of cultural values into a society, a liberal society that they say has failed. And I think it's worth debating them and telling them why they're wrong. And similarly, there are people on the far left that are basically arguing that, liberal societies are a sham. The hypocrisy isn't just a fixable hypocrisy, but go deep to the essence of liberalism, and that you have to move beyond liberalism. Some of my students, I'm actually quite shocked, when they say, well, for example, we shouldn't be treated as individuals because we're actually members of groups, and you should treat us, based on our group membership. And that, I think is deeply troubling, and, they can be convinced, I think, by the right arguments.
So there's a lot of criticism, and just to maybe wrap up this first part of our conversation, and then we move on to the world, the United States, China, which you mentioned a number of times. There's a lot of criticism, and there's a lot of legitimate criticism. And I think it's what's so great about this book is that you don't shy away from the criticism that people have to offer in terms of liberalism and liberal society. You take it right on, and you come up with a whole list of good arguments in your final chapter. why liberal societies are still the better solution to whatever alternative. But in chapter 8, you actually list a whole, a laundry list of legitimate criticisms, really, that can be made of liberal societies. And you say they're consumerist, they don't provide a strong sense of community, they're too permissive, they disrespect religious values, they're too diverse, they're not diverse enough, and so on. So the list goes on. I guess what I'm asking is, if somebody comes up with a laundry list like this, how do you respond? What are some of the fundamental arguments that you would make, and you do make in your final chapter, why liberalism is worth the fight and worth living?
Well, let's take the criticism from the right first, because I think in a way that's the bigger one that's out there right now. And it's a very straightforward one. Liberal societies deliberately do not have a single way of life that they are promoting, defined by religion or by a very deep cultural tradition. And people say, we want to have community. We don't want to be part of a global, liberal humanity that's no different from, any other, national group. We belong to this nation, and we want to emphasize the traditions of our nation. And my answer to that is that, yes, that's right, that you do not have a single, deep set of ideas, traditions, and so forth in a liberal society, but you do have community. A liberal society promotes civil society. People can voluntarily enter whatever sect, religion, club, association, interest group that they want, and that's actually how people get a lot of their satisfaction. What a liberal society does not permit is for the government to say, you must belong to this one, belief system. And that's what's not enough, I think, for a lot of both nationalists and, deep communitarians. But I think the impulse behind that is understandable, because we are social creatures. In a certain sense, this liberal premise about individualism doesn't sit well with a lot of people, because we actually do feel these very strong social ties to other human beings, and it's not always satisfied in a liberal society.
So you're saying that liberalism needs to acknowledge the need for some sort of governing and for some sort of...
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it certainly needs governing, and it also needs a sense of community. And one of the really tricky things is how do you develop a sense of liberal nationalism? Because, so this is chapter 9 in my book, because I do make an argument that liberalism needs the nation. And it's very straightforward. So there is a contradiction there, because liberals believe in the universal equality of dignity of all people, and in theory should be as upset by the violation of human rights taking place, 8,000 miles away as in their own society. And yet we are organized into nations with territorially limited jurisdiction. How do you explain that contradiction? And I try to explain it, first of all, that a right, a human right, really doesn't matter that much if it's not enforced. And really the only body that can enforce a right is a state. The state has a legitimate, this is the famous Max Weber definition, state has a monopoly of power over a legitimate monopoly of power over a jurisdiction. And if you want rights enforced, you really need a nation to do that enforcement. And then secondly, just a psychological observation that we human beings really want to feel these bonds with other people, and the largest group that we can really feel committed to are these national groups into which we are divided, and that's important for social cohesion. But the trick is, it has to be a liberal sense of identity that binds us together, and that's something that's not that easy, because in many countries, the sense of nation is a more exclusive one.
I think there couldn't be a better bridge, I think, from what you just said about nations, as we move on to and sort of widen our view a little and talk about, take the world into view a little. You mentioned nations repeatedly, and I think we probably agree that as we look at the world, geopolitics is taking on a different...
By the way,
yeah,
before we get
to
geopolitics, I just want to say this should not be interpreted as my attack on the EU.
It didn't sound like it.
I mean, I think that the EU is an extremely important and noble project, and it's been successful beyond anybody's expectations in terms of its original mission. Quite frankly, its original mission was to prevent France and Germany from going to war again. And I don't think that's going to happen, anytime in the near future. And it did construct, a liberal edifice that now is very important in maintaining, liberal values in this entire continent. I still, however, think that what the EU has not succeeded in doing is creating a sense of European identity that's stronger than the actual member state identities, which remain, extremely powerful. We've seen, lots of evidence of that, and, quite frankly, are still necessary because that's where the enforcement power lies. So, I'm not one of these people that says, the EU is a failed project and, so on and so forth.
And I remember when we met at Johns Hopkins back in 2008, I think, and you said that Europe shouldn't sell itself sort of cheap. It's a great achievement, and we should make sure to acknowledge how others look at Europe as a story of success, really. And there's lots to do still, but you made that point back in the day. So I'm glad you came back to it.
Yeah. If I could just tell one anecdote, the Vatican has a academic council for social scientists, and I was invited to this meeting in 2004 when Poland and a number of other Eastern European countries were admitted into the European Union. And at the lunch, I was sitting with a German representative who had actually served in the Wehrmacht during World War II, and the Polish representative who had been in the Polish resistance, so they were fighting on the opposite sides of the war. And, they were both there to celebrate Poland's entry into the EU, and I thought that was pretty remarkable. So not all issues between Poland and Germany have been settled, but,
And another one just came up, right?
Another one just came up.
And this is great, and I think that's laudable, and we should be happy. But as we look at the world today, and we talked about this beforehand upstairs, I think it's fair to say that we see some sort of systemic competition going on, and democracy has come under fire, and autocracy as an alternative, in a way, is either being forced on people, like Russia trying to actually force a sovereign country into submission, or else certain autocratic models are becoming attractive also for people in the West, one might argue, and that's the Chinese model, where basically politics is something off limits as long as you live your own private life and economics goes all right. And the One Belt, One Road initiative is something that China is launching successfully, and it's a way of sort of moving closer to Europe and tying relations. So as we look around the world, and I mentioned the war, I mentioned China's model, you mentioned Hungary, Poland, Italy recently, Turkey. We should also mention the events in Iran and the recent murder of Mahsa Amini, women being brutally put down and put into place by sheer force and violence. As you look at this, that systemic competition, how does your idea of liberalism square with this competition? Another way to put this would be, how does classical liberalism help modern democracy to defend itself and to be strong as these challenges come on from autocracies around the world?
Well, I mean, the first issue is that you have to know what you're fighting over and fighting for. The reason I wrote this book is that it seems to me a lot of people that actually live in a liberal society and benefit from it don't understand what it is. They couldn't define it, and they couldn't say what makes your way of life better than an alternative way, or your system, what makes it better than an alternative system. So I wanted to, explain that, because I do think that ideas are really important. again, if you look at this war in Ukraine, I mean, Putin, in his speech last week, when he announced the annexation of these 4 Ukrainian provinces, it was nothing but ideas. I mean, they're crazy ideas, but they're out there. And I think that you need to, remind people that there actually are ideas that correspond to historical reality and others that are, simply fantasies. And so that, is important. But I guess the main issue is that I've always believed that there's no automatic mechanism to history. I believe that there is something called history with a capital H, that Hegel talked about, that there is a broad pattern of social development that countries go through, but it is not predetermined. You had a lot of Marxists that believed that there's this inevitable historical mechanism that was operating independent of the wills of people. And I've always thought that was ridiculous, that you don't get historical change unless people want it. And therefore, they have to work for it, they have to mobilize, they have to struggle, for their ideas. And that's why liberalism has emerged triumphant in, certain times and places, because people did exercise their agency collectively to get to liberal outcomes. And I think we're in that period right now where we've got to struggle, because there's a lot of enemies raising their heads, and we got to push back against them.
So now that you mentioned Hegel, and you were basically describing the idea of the end of history, as you outlined it decades ago already. So would you say that the end of history now consists of, there's still a goal up ahead that we can see, but the struggle that you just described, is it more open than ever? Is it coming to a close as to, how do you look at matters now, and that systemic competition between democracy and autocracy in the broadest sense, as opposed to, say, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and German reunification was mentioned before, and as opposed to when you wrote the original essay, and it still had a question mark at it, right? The end of history.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, there's no question we're in a bad period right now. The end of history was written in the summer of 1989. A few months before the fall of the Berlin Wall. This was a period of a vast expansion of liberal democracy around the world. It started really in the early 70s with Spain and Portugal, and you had a lot of transitions that was really culminated in the fall of the wall and the fall of communism, the dissolution of the former Soviet Union. But for the last 15, 16 years, we've been in a reverse wave where things have gone the wrong way. There are more dictatorships now around the world. A lot of the promising democratic transitions in places like Myanmar, Tunisia have been reversed. And I think more importantly, the quality of democracy in some of the world's largest democracies, namely the United States and India, have gone into reverse. And that's a very disturbing development, and it means that we still have a lot of work to do if we want to have democracy prevail.
And like you said at the outset, if I understood you correctly, the main sort of mechanism that needs fixing is the liberalism part, more so even than the democracy part. Let's zoom in on Western democracies a little more and how we can strengthen these maybe, and then obviously zoom in on Germany as well, and see what's in this book for a German audience. Why should we read this? What's the sort of argument in there that helps us and helps every individual? It may sound a little grandiose, but if there is this systemic competition, and I think all of us should try and do our part. So in what way do you think, what's the insights in the book that help Western democracies come up with good arguments and feel confident about what Western liberal democracies have to offer, as opposed to the Russian model, as opposed to the Chinese model?
Well, look, I think that just looking at contemporary politics, you see why a liberal system is going to work better. A liberal system is all about constraining power, right? That the single ruler can't do whatever sometimes she wants, but has to obey the law, has to consult, has to accept judicial and legal limits on their power. And we've seen two big examples of autocratic states that have made big mistakes because they didn't have to consult. So if you remember all these pictures of Vladimir Putin sitting at the end of a 25-foot table from his defense minister, because he doesn't want to get COVID. He obviously was completely out of touch. He didn't know what was going on in Ukraine. He didn't know what was going on in his own military. And as a result, he made one of the biggest strategic blunders that I can think of in my lifetime. And I think something similar is unfolding in China right now with the zero COVID policy, which Xi Jinping seems to be very unwilling to move off of because it's very closely associated with him personally, and it's not, the result of a collective, broader consultation with Chinese society. And I think this is, kind of vivid evidence that when Russia and China say their decision-making systems are better, more decisive, I don't think that this is actually playing out in real life right now.
Is this also, I imagine, at Stanford University, I imagine there's quite a few students from China as well, like we have over here at Heidelberg University and the Free University at Berlin, Humboldt University, and so on. So is this the sort of motivation that you hear from the young generation of Chinese students as well? Why they would choose a place like Stanford, for example, and try and find their higher education there?
Well, for better or worse, the number of Chinese students in American universities, and including Stanford, has fallen very dramatically in the last 3 years. That started with COVID because they can't travel. But it's also because of security worries, because there's been a lot of intellectual property theft and this sort of thing. And so a lot of American universities have really tightened up on that. But one of the things that made me really worried about the state of liberal democracy as a whole was actually interacting with my Chinese students, because I think that 15 or 20 years ago, the majority of them would have said, we want China to be like the United States. We want it to be a free, open democracy. And none of them say that these days. They actually look on the United States with a kind of contemptuously, and they, have a lot of pride in their own China model. And so they actually don't want China to be like the United States. Quite frankly, looking at politics in the U.S., I can see why they feel that way, because I don't think Washington is a model for anybody at the moment in terms of, a well-governed, healthy democracy. And we've got to fix that problem if, we're going to project power outwards. I don't know whether you want to talk about America as part of this geopolitical survey, but I think America is in really big trouble right now. Because you actually had a former president that didn't accept the fact that he lost a legitimate election, and then he conspired to overturn the result that culminated in this, uprising on January 6th. I think we now know, because of the results of this January 6th committee, that this actually was something. It wasn't a spontaneous demonstration. It was planned beforehand. It didn't work, but that's only because of the incompetence of the planners. It wasn't a reflection of their intent. And I think, in a way, the worst thing is that they want to do it again. And so, majority of the Republican Party believes that Joe Biden stole the election. They are trying to put, as we speak, their own people in these critical lower positions to administer the next, so you're probably aware that in America, we do not have professional election administration. It's done by the two political parties who nonetheless have taken their job seriously as, neutral officials, but that's no longer the case. For the Republicans, they want to make sure that they win the next election, not that the next election is necessarily free and fair. And so, the system is under a lot of stress and danger right now. And I, can't promise you that we're going to get through 2024 successfully.
U.S. politics. You brought this onto yourself right now, but obviously the important question would be, and the scenario that you just described, I mean, is frightening in a way. And there's the upcoming midterm elections too, and probably, like you just said, people are trying to sort of set the path for 2024. So, what about liberalism with regard to current U.S. politics? You made the point in the beginning of our conversation that we need strong and solid institutions in liberalism too, also to defend us against these attempts that you just described. So what do you with regard to 2024 and what's been going on over the last couple of years and the whole Trump scenario, what's the important contribution that liberalism, as you describe it in your book, can make?
Well, you have to be a little bit more concrete about what liberalism constitutes in this particular setting.
Yeah.
And a lot of it has to do with judicial independence, and also the independence of bureaucrats and the fact that they're nonpartisan. So we had a couple of examples, like in Georgia. There was a contested election. You may know that there is this official named Brad Raffensperger, who was the state secretary in Georgia. He was a Republican. He voted for Trump. He supported Donald Trump. But when he counted the votes, he was not acting as a partisan Republican. He was acting as a responsible election official. And he saw that there wasn't any, massive fraud in the election. And he said that. And Donald Trump made this famous phone call to him and said, Brad, just find me 11,382 votes. That's all I want from you. And he refused, And Trump may actually get indicted by a prosecutor in Georgia, for having behaved that way. But that's the thing about the rule of law. The rule of law is a big abstraction. We say we want independent courts, that are not subject to political manipulation. And that's really what you mean by a kind of modern state. You need people like Brad Raffensperger that take seriously their role in a larger rule of law system, and they're not willing to bend the law just for the sake of political expedience. And I think that one of the terrible things that's going on in the United States is that there are a lot of people, especially on the Republican side, that are saying, well, our way of life is being so threatened by the other side that we're willing to even use violence in order to, prevent them from taking over. And that's the point at which, a democracy dies, I think.
And even those people will use the term liberal, as in let's defend our liberal society against all these limitations and against the attacks. Which brings me to my last point. I mean, we can't let you off the hook. You're talking U.S. politics, and obviously, this being Berlin, we have to sort of try some sort of transatlantic comparison also to a certain degree. As we look at liberal societies, I mean, the term itself, liberalism, as you use it in the United States in a way, has turned on its head the original meaning as we use liberalismus in Germany. So I think that's a funny side aspect maybe of matters. But maybe it's easier for us to talk about liberal societies as such. Do you feel that there is a real qualitative difference with regard to liberal societies in the United States and in Germany? So people have a totally different idea of liberal society. Or would you say that this is a matter of time only, and the United States is some 5 or 6 or 7 years ahead, and Germany is going to be facing the same challenges that you in the United States have been facing with Donald Trump and with Steve Bannon and people like him? Or is that like a totally different ballpark? Do you see where I'm going?
Yeah, I don't think that Germany is going to follow the United States down this path. I certainly hope it doesn't. There's several things about the United States that I think have led to this outcome. And one is our racial history, frankly. We elected Barack Obama, and at that point, many people said, the United States is now a post-racial society. And I wish that were true, but, I think on the right, it set off a lot of alarm bells, that how could we elect a black person president? And frankly, kind of crude sort of racism has reemerged in the United States that didn't exist, or or couldn't be expressed publicly 10 years ago. Plus, we had Donald Trump, and I think actually individuals make a lot of difference, and he is a just monumentally unscrupulous demagogue, you know, of a sort that I can't think of another American politician that in a sense is less principled and less committed to basic American political values than this guy.
And the ex-president.
Yeah, than the ex-president. And, you know, right now something like 70% of Republicans believe the last election was stolen. And they only believe that because that's what he believes. And he's told them that, you know, that's what the truth is. They're not actually anti-democratic because they actually believe that they're the ones defending democracy. You know, if you believe that Joe Biden stole the last election, then yeah, you're going to be really mad, and you know, you're going to do things like storm the Capitol to prevent him from taking power. And so that's unfortunately the consequence of, you know, this combination of kind of social conditions plus, you know, really bad leadership.
Yeah. Let me rephrase that question. And you're a astute observer of U.S. politics and also German politics and policy. Do you detect any like dangers in Germany? You know, with the political system, with preferences that people utter, with the elections. What's the where's the breaking point that you would say we need to watch out here? So we don't go down the path of the United States in terms of liberalism. You know, you made the point that it needs solid institutions and so on. What needs
I don't know that
taking care
there's
of?
a clear breaking point. You obviously have the AfD and, you know, a right-wing populist party that has some definitely very illiberal currents in it. And so far you've managed to keep them out of power. And I think it's important to keep doing that. If you have another election in which they make, you know, the kinds of gains that, you know, Giorgia Meloni's party made in Italy, that would obviously be a big, you know, warning sign. But, you know, I don't think there's any inevitability to that happening.
So you make it sound like it's about reading books like yours and trying to reach people and raise political awareness in the first place. Less so. It's not so much about reforming political institutions.
No, you do need to reform political institutions. I mean, as a political scientist, I actually think that the German system is pretty good right now. You know, one of our big problems in the United States is our first-past-the-post voting system that tends to produce two political parties that then get very polarized, whereas your mixed-member proportional system, I think, is actually the right mixture of being able to vote for a local candidate plus, you know, the possibility of a multi-party system. That's good. I actually think that the way that the German Constitution was rewritten as a result of the experience of Weimar, you know, in 1949, made a lot of improvements in terms of the balance of power, where you don't have this Weimar problem of an extremely weak center. You know, it added to the stability of parliamentary majorities, you know, this rule about not being able to dissolve parliament unless you've got an alternative government avoids this Italian-Israeli, you know, problem that other parliamentary democracies have. So I think you Germans should be pretty happy with, you know, the basic set of institutions, because I think that, you know, everything can be fixed in different ways, but I would say that this is one of the more successful countries. The other thing has to do with the party system. Right. So the center-left and center-right parties have obviously seen a lot of erosion over the last 2 decades, but nothing like in other countries where, you know, in Italy, Christian Democrats and socialists just get wiped out, you know, in a single election, or, you know, many other places where, you know, the French Socialist Party has really disappeared. There's a lot of instability that, you know, will be warning signs if it happens here that, you know, hopefully will not.
That was the big picture for sure. There was a lot of geopolitics. There was history with a capital H, maybe, that you mentioned before. So all of tonight has been about the big picture, I think. So first of all, thank you very much, Francis Fukuyama, for sharing your thoughts and for making it to Berlin. It's been an honor and a pleasure. Thank you very much to all of you for joining us tonight and for thinking along and for sort of stepping out of your everyday lives and making the effort. I would encourage you to buy the book and have it signed by the author and to continue our conversation at the reception that will take place, if I'm not mistaken, at the room over yonder. So basically behind the stage there's going to be snacks and wine, and there's going to be lots of food for thought that you so generously offered. So thank you very much, and a big round of applause.
I'd like to say one. Thank you. If I could just say one further thing, Germany should support Ukraine very strongly.
Thank you very much once again to the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, to the International Literature Festival Berlin, and to everybody involved. Thanks very much for coming.